Hello again, everyone. It is Gordon Majak here, back with another episode from this spiritual journey, this profound spiritual journey out here on planet Earth in 2024 on a wonderful Wednesday. Well, in my previous video there, I spoke about an excerpt from the writings of one of my great spiritual teachers, and that was, of course, Professor Edmond Bordeaux Szekely, and I read a sample of his work from his book, The Essene Book of Creation, and the title of the chapter that I was reading from was about the three paths to truth. Well, today I want to talk about another one of my spiritual teachers, and in reality, my primary spiritual teacher, who I've mentioned on a few occasions, and that was the Reverend Elizabeth MacDonald Burrows. Now, I mentioned in the previous video there, when I was reading Professor Szekely's book excerpt, I mentioned that my teacher, Elizabeth Burrows, had been a direct student of Professor Szekely back there in the late 1970s before he passed away in 1979. So that's why I have said I sort of look at Professor Szekely as my spiritual grandfather, and then my direct teacher, Elizabeth MacDonald Burrows, I see Elizabeth, I think of Elizabeth as my spiritual mother. So today I wanted to read something to you. This is an excerpt from something I wrote myself several years ago when I was working on my spiritual bio and my background. And this sort of describes a little bit of my spiritual background as a younger person, and then how I met my teacher, Elizabeth Burrows, in the early 1980s. And I thought it would be interesting for you guys to get a little bit of a better idea of my background, but also to, in this case with Elizabeth, just to illustrate there's so many different ways that you can meet a spiritual teacher, and the way I met my primary spiritual teacher. And I've had many teachers, not directly and personally, but Elizabeth was my primary teacher directly and personally. There's so many different ways that you can meet a teacher and come across someone that's going to change your life, and you just never know. So I thought it'd be interesting for you guys to hear how I came across my first teacher way back in the old days. So this is, again, from my bio that I had written several years ago, and I'm just going to read these first few pages here, and I think you might find it interesting on how I found my teacher. Here we go. I never knew it at the time, but looking back on it now, it's clear to me that as a child, I was fortunate to grow up in a household where my parents never exerted any particular religious influence on me, other than the usual moral lessons that all kids were taught about right and wrong. In fact, with the exception of an Easter Sunday service that I attended with my beloved grandmother when I was a little kid — my grandmother was a faithful Catholic — I don't recall setting foot in a church as a kid for anything other than a funeral or a wedding. And so, unencumbered by any religious affiliations or specific ideologies and the suffocating dogma that goes with them, I gradually developed a very natural curiosity for spiritual ideas and the meaning or purpose of my life as a youth growing up in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. My earliest and most profound memory of what I would now consider a life-changing event with spiritual ramifications came in 1971 when I heard a song called "Imagine" on the radio. As a 13-year-old with a keen ear for the pop music of the day, I was familiar with the Beatles and John Lennon. But "Imagine" was different. Those lyrics struck an inner chord with me that was far deeper and more compelling than anything else I'd ever heard. Of course, John Lennon was not the first person to evoke the notion of a brotherhood of man. Mystics, philosophers, and spiritual masters throughout history have written and spoken of our interconnectedness, and often linking the act of relating to one another as brothers and sisters with the dawn of a great golden age of humanity. But nonetheless, to my impressionable teenage ears, Lennon's utopian vision was no less sublime than the greatest teachings of the ancient masters. In the high school years that followed shortly thereafter, my love for music frequently overlapped with my expanding interest in spiritual ideas, until eventually the two were inextricably bound. After Imagine came two more songs that created a profound and lasting impact in my life. In 1974, a song by my favorite band, Chicago, reflected the deeper sense of meaning I was experiencing in my own life. I've Been Searching So Long quickly became my coming-of-age anthem when I was 16, and one which has only continued to inspire me in the years since. In 1975, the soundtrack for my path of spirituality broadened again when I discovered the mystical themes explored in the music of Earth, Wind, and Fire. The group's name derived from the elements associated with the zodiac signs and leader Maurice White's astrology chart. Powerful, uplifting songs such as That's the Way of the World were my equivalent of sacred hymns for the devout, guiding my ongoing personal quest and influencing my worldview in the process. We're getting there. My teacher's coming up. By the time I was 20 years old, I had taken night classes in astrology and psychology, studied past lives and reincarnation, and read many of the spiritual classics, including such perennial favorites as Khalil Gibran's The Prophet, Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, and Lao Tzu's The Tao Te Ching. But still I felt something was missing. No matter how many books I read or influences I absorbed, I sensed that I hadn't found the missing puzzle piece, the key that would allow me to unlock more of my inner self and realize even more of my potential as a spiritual being. But that all changed in 1981. Musical gurus like John Lennon and Maurice White were just a few of the brilliant creative sparks behind my initial spiritual journeys as a teenager. As I began to move into adulthood, I longed for a more direct personal experience with a spiritual teacher. I eventually found what I'd been looking for just a few months shy of my 23rd birthday. In early 1981, I saw an ad in the newspaper for a seminar by a woman named Elizabeth MacDonald Burrows. What first captured my attention was that in the picture accompanying the ad, Elizabeth was dressed all in a white tunic. The ad promoted Reverend Dr. Elizabeth Burrows as a Christian mystic who taught something called the secret teachings of Jesus. I had never been a Christian, but I had no particular feelings one way or the other about Jesus as a spiritual teacher. It was his Bible-thumping followers who annoyed me. But the possibility of learning about his secret teachings piqued my interest. As a skeptic of mainstream religions, I was intrigued by Elizabeth's willingness to not only embrace, but teach publicly a subject that flew squarely in the face of traditional church dogma. I attended that seminar and found Elizabeth Burrows to be a compelling speaker with a commanding presence that exuded a distinct blend of power, love, and wisdom. During her introduction, Elizabeth claimed her expertise in the esoteric or hidden teachings of Christianity. She described her own spiritual journey of having attained the state of cosmic consciousness, or oneness with God, in 1971. I had read and heard about the concept of spiritual enlightenment and cosmic consciousness, and I thought I understood the basic idea. But in Elizabeth Burrows, I saw an individual whose very being emanated a higher vibration. Elizabeth explained that she wore the all-white clothing to honor and respect the traditions of the Essenes, the white symbolizing the purity of soul consciousness manifest in the ancient brotherhood of which Jesus was believed to be a member. Elizabeth Burrows taught that the highly advanced spiritual state of the Essene communities, in which she herself had achieved, was not the exclusive domain of Jesus or some famous saints or just a few chosen. Cosmic consciousness and union with God was available to all and was in fact the inevitable destiny of all spiritual aspirants who had passed the necessary trials of countless lifetimes. According to Elizabeth, each and every person would eventually conquer the lofty peaks of spiritual mastership, because God's eternal laws of evolution and soul progression promised as much. If there was such a thing as a key to unlocking the highest potential of one's soul, I was convinced that Elizabeth Burrows had found it. I knew upon meeting her that I wanted more of what she had to offer. The impression that Elizabeth Burrows left on me with that initial seminar proved to be indelible. I purchased 2 of her books, Pathway of the Immortal and The Gospel of Peace of Jesus the Christ, that first day, and immersed myself in a wisdom that was both simple and profound. Some of Elizabeth's teachings relating to Jesus and the Essenes were based on the works of Professor Edmond Bordeaux Szekely, who had discovered the original texts of the Essene Gospel of Peace buried in the archives in the Vatican in the 1920s. Elizabeth had studied directly with Professor Szekely prior to his passing in 1979, and she spoke fondly of this spiritual giant of a man whom she reasoned had left the world a legacy it could likely never repay. From that point forward, I studied Elizabeth's books side by side with Professor Szekely's material, and before long I discovered a strong inner connection to Professor that would only deepen in the years ahead. Elizabeth Burrows was in some ways the spiritual descendant of Professor Szekely, and in my heart I felt blessed just to be part of their incredible lineage. When I read in the Gospel of Peace that Jesus had actually taught his inner circle of disciples a health and nutrition program based upon strict vegetarianism, I immediately cut all meat products from my diet. As it turned out, becoming a vegetarian was one of the easier aspects of walking what Elizabeth called the path of mastership. Although I occasionally attended classes or seminars and continued reading the books, it quickly became apparent that I lacked both the discipline and the maturity to progress much further on my spiritual path, at least at that time. Elizabeth often reminded her students that man cannot serve 2 masters, and my 1980s music business lifestyle wasn't about to go quietly into that dark night. So that takes us up there to the early 80s when I very first met my beloved teacher, Elizabeth MacDonald Burrows, and was exposed not only to her vast library of work, but as I said, the wonderful work of Professor Szekely as well. And I just thought it would be interesting for you guys to kind of hear not only my background, but in particular how I came to meet my teacher. That is certainly not the end of my story with Elizabeth Burrows, because as we will discuss in a future episode, maybe not the next episode, but at some point in the future, I'll talk about the rest of my history with Elizabeth, which came full circle there really in the late 1990s when she ordained me and initiated me into the mysteries, and then even well into the 2000s when I ended up helping her with some books that she was writing and rewriting toward the end of her life. So our relationship that began back there in the early 80s ended up lasting well into the 2000s, probably 30 years. So it's a very beautiful story, and obviously a hugely important story to me for my personal history and my spiritual development. I can't even, my mind isn't big enough to imagine even with my exposure to other spiritual ideas and books and teachings and teachers, etc., even with the exposure to the other teachers I had, I just can't even imagine my life all these years without my teacher, my personal teacher, and without the work of Professor Szekely. I really, look at the 2 of them together because it was such a foundational aspect of my beliefs and really my spiritual core. So a very beautiful thing. I love them both. I love both of my beautiful master teachers so much, and what a profound impact. Boy, you just never forget. You never forget. You never forget your teachers. And it's amazing, just absolutely amazing, the connection not only that's possible in the physical world, in the 3D world of having a teacher directly in your life, but also knowing the inner plane ramifications that go along with it. So just a beautiful story right there. Let me find, where is my little deli bob here? Oh, here we go. I'm in the car and the train is coming by and I'm just about to wrap it up and I couldn't find my little button. So there you go. That's a little background. It was such a beautiful thing, you know, that I did the video the other day talking about Professor Szekely's writings there in the Essene Book of Creation, and talking about the 3 paths to truth according to Professor. And I was just so blown away by the response of you guys and the views, and just so many people watching that video. It's been absolutely mind-blowing here in the last few days to see the reception for that material. And at the time when I did it a few days ago, when I did the video, you know, I wanted to do it because it's something that meant a lot to me, and something that I have so much respect for Professor, and just wanted to present that as his perspective, one master's perspective on the many paths that our souls can take on these spiritual journeys. And so to see that reaction, to see the number of views for a soul and a human being that I hold in such high regard, was just really a lovely thing. So I thank each and every one of you out there who watched that previous video. That was just lovely. Really touched my heart and soul. So what a beautiful thing. Thank you so much for that. I hope you enjoyed this one. Let me know in the comments, how did you guys meet your spiritual teachers? Did you sign up for a meditation class and the teacher ended up becoming your personal teacher? Did you meet a yoga guru and find it through yoga or some other discipline? There's so many different paths and so many different ways to discover a teacher, but boy, teachers can change your life, can't they? See you again in the next one. Hope you all have a lovely evening out there on planet Earth. Keep waking up. Keep waking up. Wake up into this beautiful world that we are creating. See you guys soon.